It was noon on the first day of school. The principal noticed a first grader who had previously attended half-day preschool. He noticed that the first grader was outside with his backpack at the bus loading zone. So the principal went out and asked, "Young man, why aren't you in class? It's time to go home." No, you're in first grade now, and you'll be staying at school all day long instead of just a half day. Well, who signed me up for this? That's Peter. That's Peter this morning in the gospel text. Who signed me up for this? If the one I follow is to suffer, I might also be asked to suffer. And I don't recall signing up for this. It's not the image of the Messiah that I had, that we have. We live in a culture that doesn't like pain. No need for pain. I don't like pain. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much pain? I want 0. I remember being in the emergency department of Catawba Valley Medical Center in Hickory with a kidney stone. Most painful thing I've ever experienced. And they weren't moving fast enough to address that. And so I started going, and they moved pretty quickly to get me to 0 on the pain continuum. We don't like pain. And if you look at what Jesus did in his ministry, feeding, healing, compassion that he showed, it makes it clear that God does not take any delight in human suffering. Anyone who says differently is not referring to the Jesus that I follow, the God that I experience. But sometimes suffering is necessary. It happens. When you and I love someone, we are choosing pain, whether we realize it or not. Inevitably, there's illness, the loved one dies, there's conflict, on and on. There's suffering. Our life is not a choice between pain and no pain. Our lives, the choice that we face is the choice of pain, the pain of loving, or the pain of not loving. Those are our two choices. But Peter doesn't want a suffering Messiah. He wants a triumphant Messiah. And so he tempts Jesus to use power and violence rather than suffering and self-surrender. However, coercion and force are not the way of the gospel. Coercion and force do not create disciples. So there's Peter here trying to talk some sense into Jesus, trying to slow him down. Isn't there another way, Jesus? Any way that we can get out, that you can get out of this suffering? Surely we can get the job done without pain. Come on, Jesus, let's do better than that. Sometimes when we face a decision, there are multiple options. But here, there are only two. Either we take the role of Satan or the role of a disciple. That's it. Either we set our mind, as the text reminds us, on the things of God or on the things of humankind. And so in these familiar words, Jesus says to Peter, to you and me, "Get behind me, Satan." Jesus is not merely saying, "Get away from me," but also, "Get in line, Peter. Take your appropriate place as a disciple, Peter, with the other disciples." Did you hear the text? Peter takes Jesus aside to talk to him in private. But in response, Jesus turns, looks at the disciples, and calls Peter on the carpet in front of all the disciples. Why? Why does he do that? Perhaps Jesus is afraid that this is a virus that will take hold in the midst of the disciples, and he wants to shut it down before it gets going. So as a way of explaining what it means to follow him, he speaks of what it means to be a disciple. We must deny ourselves. What does that mean? There's a common misconception that is around about being a disciple of Jesus. And that is to deny myself. To deny ourselves, we have to hate ourselves. But that's a perversion of the gospel. Love our neighbor as ourself, not instead of ourselves. I believe that denying ourselves means that we feel so good about ourselves, we love ourselves so appropriately that we don't have to put ourselves first. We're not trying to fill some big empty space in our hearts and in our lives. But we love ourselves so much that we can give ourselves to others. We are able to put others first out of the fullness of our own lives and out of our positive sense of self-worth. The fact of the matter is that sometimes things that look like extreme self-love really are self-hate. It's born out of not feeling good about ourselves. It comes from a well of insecurity and emptiness. Jesus is saying if you love yourself appropriately, it won't always have to be about you. It won't be self. Narcissism has no place in the life of a disciple. Narcissism is defined as a mental health condition characterized by a grandiose sense of self-importance and an excessive need for admiration, a lack of empathy, and a belief in being unique or special. This pattern of thinking and behavior affects many areas of the narcissist's life and often results in exploitative, selfish, and arrogant conduct toward others. End of quote. That disorder has no place in the life of a disciple of Jesus. We do not have to live in the prison of narcissism, which is born out of deep emptiness in our lives. If we love ourselves appropriately, we will be able to love others appropriately. In the early part of the text, we hear Peter's great confession that Jesus is the Messiah, an incredible commitment. But here he flips on us from a commitment to be possessed by Jesus to an attempt to possess Jesus. Peter wants control, wants to play God. He wants to help keep Jesus, his neighbor, from suffering. But the appropriate love of neighbor permits us to give our neighbor freedom to live out his or her own sense of commitment, even if it means suffering for them, and perhaps even with them. When my best friend in the world lost his wife of 50 years to pancreatic cancer, we suffered with him because we loved them. This Messiah, this Jesus, is the one who calls us to the very difficult task of giving up our lives for the sake of the gospel. Perhaps giving up some of our comfort so that others may have something comforting. Following this Jesus, being a disciple, means relating to and caring for the most irritating and demanding among us. Let those who have ears to hear, hear. It means forgiving when forgiveness seems too hard and undeserved. It means reaching out to the outcasts in our midst. It means putting others before ourselves. Is that a Messiah you and I can follow? Some days we're not sure, are we? So we try to tell Jesus what kind of Messiah we want him to be, because that's far easier than listening to him about what kind of disciple, what kind of follower he wants us to be. Jesus wants us to get behind him, to get in line as a disciple. So what does that mean? It means seeing the world through the eyes and the heart of Jesus, seeing the world through his perspective. It even means seeing Scripture, interpreting Scripture in the light of Jesus. We see Scripture through the Jesus lens, which all of Scripture and life needs to be interpreted. Not a couple of verses in Leviticus or some other text. Jesus invites us to say no to self. If we feel good enough about ourselves, if we love ourselves, we can deny ourselves and love others appropriately. And then verse 38's not a pleasant verse, is it? I struggled with this growing up. Those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. How are we ashamed, and what are some of the indicators that you and I are ashamed? We are ashamed of Jesus and who God created us to be when we look on a world of hurting people and fail to respond to God's call to care for and minister with them. When we are the disciples that he calls us to be, we are free for the world. We are free to be salt and light in a world that is decaying and living in darkness. We are even free to suffer for the sake of others. The movie Shadowlands, which came out 20 years or so ago, is the poignant story of C.S. Lewis and his wife, Joy, who he married later in life. She died of cancer. The closing line of the movie is a voiceover by Anthony Hopkins, who plays the role of Lewis. As the movie ends, Lewis is grieving Joy's death, and Lewis says through Anthony Hopkins, "As a boy, I chose safety," because he had never grieved the death of his mother. As a boy, I chose safety. As a man, I chose suffering. In this instance, he chose to stay in the pain, chose to suffer. For as Lewis said, something must drive us out of our nursery into the world of others, and that something is suffering. Empathy, not apathy. Remember, life is not a choice between pain or no pain, but the pain of loving and the pain of not loving. When we choose to stay in pain, when we love so much that we are free to suffer, then you and I become more and more like the Jesus we claim to follow. In this text, Jesus answers very clearly what kind of Messiah, what kind of Jesus he is. Now, sisters and brothers, it's up to us. What kind of disciple will you be? Will you be a disciple at all? Well, will you?